Under the blistering Italian sun of 225 BCE, the fields outside the Tuscan town of Telamon shimmered with heat and dust, and into this furnace of air and soil marched an army unlike any Rome had ever seen. Men stripped bare of tunics, shields gleaming but bodies naked, their skin glistening with oil and sweat, their muscles tensed beneath war paint and scars, their very nudity a weapon meant to terrify. To the Roman eye, drilled in the discipline of ordered ranks, shining helmets, and iron breastplates, the sight of thousands of Gauls advancing unclothed was a vision at once obscene and awe-inspiring, as if the line between man and beast had been deliberately erased. This was no madness of poverty or desperation, but a deliberate show of defiance, a calculated theater of terror. To cast aside armor, to strip away every barrier of protection, was to announce to the enemy that one feared nothing, not even death, and that shame itself had no place in battle. Polybius, who centuries later would write of this clash, captured in cool Greek prose what Roman veterans could scarcely recount without shuddering. The Gauls, massive men from Cisalpine tribes, advanced unclothed to display their strength, believing that the sight of their bodies, unguarded and fierce, would unnerve and break the resolve of the legions arrayed against them. Yet beneath the spectacle of nudity lay a deeper truth. This was a people pressed by hunger for land, desperate to carve a place in Italy, and driven to gamble everything in a single confrontation that would either secure their future or annihilate them. For the Romans, Telamon was not meant to be a mere border skirmish, but a test of survival, for the Senate had feared the Gallic migrations for generations. 2 centuries earlier, in 390 BCE, a different horde had stormed through Etruria and burned Rome itself, a trauma seared into memory, a wound passed from grandfather to grandson in whispers and oaths of vengeance. Now, when news came that an immense Gallic host was on the march again, Rome had summoned every reserve, rallying allies and mustering consular armies on a scale not seen in decades. The Gauls, for their part, were no simple rabble. They brought with them mercenary cavalry from across the Alps, war chariots bristling with blades, and warriors whose only creed was to frighten the enemy into collapse before swords had even crossed. Their nakedness, then, was not madness but strategy, an attempt to weaponize spectacle, to turn the battlefield into theater, to remind Romans of ancestral terror. And as the two sides converged upon Telamon, fate ensured that this would not be a battle of skirmishes or raids, but a collision of civilizations fought under the unrelenting gaze of a midsummer sky that showed no mercy. The clash itself unfolded with a brutality that defied language. When the Gauls realized that both Roman consuls had maneuvered to trap them, one army barring their retreat, the other closing in from behind, their naked warriors surged forward in desperation, their bodies slick with blood and dust, their cries echoing across the valley like the howls of men already half in the world of the dead. They fought with the reckless fury of those who had cut away every safeguard, unshielded torsos split beneath pila, limbs hacked by Roman gladii. Yet still they pressed forward, their muscles convulsing in final acts of defiance, as though to prove that death itself could be shamed by the display of fearless flesh. For the Romans, victory came not swiftly, but through grinding attrition, the disciplined press of shields and spears slowly crushing the wild charges until the naked tide broke apart. And when the field was at last theirs, the ground was strewn with bodies unclothed, sprawled in grotesque tableau of agony, their nudity no longer a weapon, but a cruel exposure and defeat. What remained afterward was not just a Roman triumph, but a memory calculated to terrify anyone who might dream of rising against the Republic. Tens of thousands of Gauls lay dead. Their leaders were paraded in chains, their tribes scattered back beyond the Alps. Rome had not merely won a battle, but erased a terror that had haunted it for generations, replacing the story of burning Rome with the story of naked barbarians, crushed under legionary discipline. Yet, in victory lay also unease. The Romans could never unsee what they had witnessed, men fighting stripped to their essence, armed only with courage and rage, embodying in their nudity both the nobility of defiance and the futility of pride. For the Gauls had wagered everything on a spectacle, and though the spectacle shook Rome to its core, In the end, it had been ground into the dust, leaving only the lesson that bravery without armor is theater without survival. But memory is a trickster, and history does not always obey the wishes of victors. Though the Romans celebrated Telamon as a cleansing of ancestral shame, the story of the naked warriors lingered, retold not only as a tale of barbarian folly, but as a strange, almost haunting reminder of what it meant to fight without disguise. Generations later, when Polybius put pen to parchment, he did not describe the Gauls merely as savages, but as men who had chosen spectacle as their final weapon, who had gambled their very flesh as a shield. And perhaps that is why the story still unsettles. Because even in their destruction, the image of those unclothed warriors refuses to die, as if their ghostly ranks still march across the plains of Tuscany, defying shame, defying armor, defying the silence Rome tried to impose upon them. The battlefield at Telamon was not merely a place of death, it was a canvas of meaning. When the dust settled, the Roman legions did not simply look upon corpses, they gazed upon a lesson carved into flesh. Thousands of Gauls lay sprawled across the plain, their naked bodies twisted in grotesque shapes, the sun glinting off wounds where no armor had intervened, their pride turned into exposure. For the Romans, accustomed to funerary rites and the dignity of clothing even in death, the sight was unbearable. Nakedness in life was one thing, an act of bravado, a cry of terror, but nakedness in death was humiliation, the stripping away not only of protection, but of humanity itself. And yet the Romans could not look away. They marched among the bodies, not as soldiers surveying victory, but as men confronted with the raw truth of what courage without defense becomes. The victory was absolute. Polybius would record that some 40,000 Gauls were slain, their leaders captured, their power broken in Italy for a generation. The Senate, upon receiving news, erupted in jubilation. Sacrifices were ordered, triumphs planned. The Republic reassured that its ancestral terror of northern barbarians had at last been avenged. For centuries, Roman mothers had whispered of the day the Gauls burned the city, using it to frighten children into obedience. Now, a counter-myth was born, the tale of Telamon, where those same barbarians had dared to fight naked, only to be crushed by disciplined steel and order. The story became part of Rome's identity, woven into the fabric of its confidence, a reminder that the Republic, through courage and unity, could master even the most terrifying of foes. But history is never so simple. For beneath the official story of triumph lingered a darker reflection, one that the more thoughtful Romans could not ignore. The Gauls had chosen to fight unclothed, not out of madness, but out of principle. In their culture, nudity was the ultimate proof of fearlessness, a way to show the gods and men alike that their courage was unshakable. To cast aside armor was to announce, "I do not fear the blade, nor the arrow, nor the spear. Strike me, and you will only prove my strength." The Romans, who prided themselves on practicality and restraint, found this incomprehensible, almost obscene, and yet part of them could not help but be unsettled by the sight of men who chose to face death stripped to nothing but their own skin. Polybius, ever the analyst, wrote with cool detachment that the naked warriors were more vulnerable to Roman missiles, that their lack of armor contributed to their destruction. To him, it was tactical folly dressed up as bravery. But even as he dismissed them, the image he preserved was one of strange dignity, of men who had chosen to die in a way that made their very bodies into symbols. Their blood became ink on the pages of history, their defeat a paradox, crushed, yet remembered more vividly than many who conquered. For the Romans who survived Telamon, the memory of victory was inseparable from the memory of those naked charges, the sight of humanity reduced to its most primal state. The aftermath was brutal. Captives were taken, chains rattling as they were marched through Roman streets, displayed as trophies of barbarian hubris. Lands were seized, allies rewarded, and the Senate used the triumph to reinforce Rome's authority across Italy. Yet even in their boasting, Romans carried something of the Gauls with them, a subconscious recognition that their enemies had shown a kind of courage Rome itself rarely demanded. To stand naked under a rain of javelins, to fight against iron ranks with nothing but skin and will, was madness by Roman measure, but it was also a mirror held up to their own fears. What if one day Rome herself was asked to strip away her armor, her wealth, her walls, her legions, and face an enemy bare? Would her courage be enough, or was it discipline and steel alone that gave her power? In the centuries that followed, Telamon became a warning as much as a boast. Roman generals invoked it as proof of Rome's superiority, a lesson to allies and enemies alike. Barbarian spectacle would always collapse before Roman order. And yet, the story also traveled in subtler whispers, reshaped in taverns and borderlands, where veterans described not just the slaughter but the uncanny sight of thousands fighting as if shame itself had been slain before the battle even began. To those who heard such tales, the Gauls were not merely fools, but martyrs of their own creed, men who chose to terrify even as they perished. And so the story endured, carved not just into Polybius's history, but into the imagination of all who pondered what it means to face death. The Romans won Telamon, yes, but the Gauls left behind something Rome could not erase, the unforgettable image of warriors fighting as they were born, unclothed and unashamed, announcing with every breath that courage, however futile, can still defy the silence of history.